What are some of the things that we really, truly should be ashamed of in our history as imperial governors?
So just a qualification. When I first began to think about these things about 8 years ago, yes, I talked in terms. I wrote an article in the London Times saying that we Brits can find cause in our imperial past for both pride and shame. But someone persuaded me actually that's not appropriate because you and I didn't do it, so
Yep.
we've no reason to feel guilty ourselves. So I talk now in terms of admiration and lament. So I lament things that if not my ancestors directly, then ancestors of my British people did. So what are the lamentable things? Well, to be lamented is the importation of disease. Probably the most devastating effect of colonization upon natives in North America and in Australia were diseases brought by Europeans and the British. Diseases to which we become immune because we've been used to living with domesticated animals, and we become immune to the germs that they spread. But the natives of North America were not immune, nor were Aboriginal peoples. And so when Europeans first landed and first started interacting with the natives, the spread of disease was actually devastating. One American historian says that in the 1700s, if a Native American people suffered successive epidemics of disease over a 50-year period, they would lose 90% of their population. So that was terrible, and that's one reason why a lot of land was vacant. But here's the thing: no one intended to do that. There are only a couple of possible occasions when the British, once during the French and Indian Wars of the 1750s, 60s, possibly during the American Revolutionary War, when the British may have used disease as a biological weapon. But there are only one or two occasions. Most of the devastation was caused inadvertently, and what you do inadvertently, you can't be blamed for. So, by analogy, let's suppose the Communist Party of China did not deliberately spread COVID. Okay, we may want to blame them for not shutting their airports sooner, but the disease was spread, I think, inadvertently, but 7 million people died. And also, just to confirm that point, of course, it wasn't just Europeans who spread disease. It is, I think, widely accepted that smallpox first arrived on the northern coast of Australia, brought by fishermen from what's now Indonesia. Right, so spread of disease is unfortunately a universal phenomenon. It's not only white people who do it, and most of it was done inadvertently. So that was probably the most devastating thing. More culpable, lamentable things would have been, yes, the unjust seizure of land, and the expulsion of native peoples. It happened in North America, it happened in Africa, it happened in Australia. It didn't always happen. That wasn't always how land was acquired, but it did happen. And sometimes massively murderous killings of native peoples by British people in Australia or North America. So excessive violence. And yes, sometimes economic exploitation. I mean, a lot of people are very critical of the exploitation of Black Africans in South African mines in the late 1800s, early 1900s. where conditions were very poor. Um, I'm I I tend to be a bit resistant to that simply because when is exploitation exploitation? I mean, African workers were not compelled to work for the mines. They chose to come. They were encouraged by, or coerced somewhat by the imposition of taxes. But they came, and they came again to work. And yes, the conditions were poor, but the conditions were poor for miners in Northumberland at the same time. And partly through the pressure from imperial authorities, the mine owners were forced to improve the conditions. But just as a matter of, I mean, I assume that there were certainly cases of unfair exploitation of native workers. They weren't paid enough, or they were worked too hard. But again, I mean, there was exploitation in England at the time, and no doubt there's been exploitation by native entrepreneurs in post-colonial times. But this reminds me, of course, of probably the greatest lamentable stain on the record of the British Empire, which was the 150 plus years of slave trading and slavery, starting in about 1650, ending in the trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1834. That clearly was the greatest stain, and that's why our contemporary decolonizing critics want us to equate colonialism with slavery. The phrase colonialism and slavery is often spoken with in the same breath as if it was the same thing. And while the British involvement in slavery was certainly lamentable, I just point out that the second half of the British Empire's life was committed to anti-slavery, so you can't identify them. There was both. Fortunately, the anti-slavery followed the slavery and replaced it. The other thing to say about slavery is just to remember that for reasons that bear thinking about, slave trading and slavery was universal. Europeans did not go into the interior of Africa to seize slaves. Slaves were brought to them by Africans who had been enslaving other Africans and selling them to the Romans before they sold them to Arabs, before they sold them to Europeans. So the British, we can lament British involvement in slavery. We need to remember that most people were involved in enslavement and slavery. And I think we should be proud and admiring of the fact that toward the end of the 1700s, more and more Britons became convinced that slavery was abhorrent and should be stopped. And they stopped it. Thank goodness.